Okay, thank you.
Okay, so just to give you a little background about Harlan, Harlan was born and raised in Texas, where he received his bachelor's degree in botany from Stephen F. Foster State, Austin State University. He then completed a doctorate in plant systematics from Ohio University, studying the taxonomy of tropical passion flowers. And since 2018, he has been the curator of the herbarium collections at the U.S. National Arboretum, which houses the National Arboretum Herbarium and the I hope you can't hear my cat throwing up in the background. Sorry about that. Sorry. Which houses the which houses the National Arboretum Herbarium and the National Seed Herbarium, and he has been leading the USDA in digitizing its bio collections and making these accessible online, which is really excellent and important. His talk tonight, which I'm very excited to hear, is the enduring legacy of the USDA's botanical explorations. So Harlan, if you want to take it away, I think you have screen sharing allowed, right? Okay.
Yep, I believe so. So just give me a second here to get this going. Okay. Switch this over. Okay. Hopefully you can all see my presentation all right. Good. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to speak with you this evening, the first meeting of the new year. Very exciting. Hope you all had a very good new year. So as Greg said, I am going to talk today about the botanical explorations that have been going on and still go on under the auspices of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So just to give you kind of a little bit of an idea of who I am, I'm not just some random guy talking about USDA stuff. So I am the herbarium curator at the U.S. National Arboretum. We're part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, specifically the Agricultural Research Service is our agency. So those of you who are here in the Washington area probably know about us. We're in Northeast DC. We have about 450 acres of open garden space. A lot of what we do is very much research based, but of course we have beautiful plants that we're researching and growing there. So we open things up to the public. We're free and open to the public. We have free parking and everything. So come and see us. We also, as Greg mentioned in my introduction, we have two preserved collections here at the National Arboretum. So we have the National Arboretum Herbarium. These are the kind of typical pressed preserved plant specimens that you might be familiar with, but we also house the National Seed Herbarium as well. So this is a collection of basically preserved seeds that are in vials or bags, and it is the largest and most comprehensive preserved seed collection in the world. So going back to kind of our roots at the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture was founded in 1862 by President Abraham Lincoln. And among the many things that Lincoln wanted the Department of Agriculture to do was to procure, propagate, and distribute among the people new and valuable seeds and plants. And this is kind of at the core of what he was envisioning as the USDA. And it's also kind of interesting, it's noteworthy to mention that Lincoln actually took the time to discuss plant introductions and this whole idea about the USDA in the same address in which he provided details on the Emancipation Proclamation, which is kind of interesting. It just kind of goes to show you how invested he was in this idea about a Department of Agriculture. And so for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to be kind of focusing on four major themes here. So I can't talk about everything, unfortunately. If I skip over your favorite plant exploration, I apologize. We only have so much time. So to start with, I'm going to be talking about kind of our early explorers, the ones that really kind of set the tone for plant explorations within the department. I'm going to go into kind of a case study, if you will, about coffee, how the USDA really essentially saved the coffee industry in the 60s. NACPEC, collaborating with our Chinese institutions overseas, and then really kind of just bring it all home with our national plant germplasm system, this network across the country that really focuses on procuring, protecting, preserving plant germplasm within the country. So to begin with, we'll kind of go back to the beginning and look at some of our early explorers. You might know some of these folks. These names might be at least familiar to you. So these were all USDA employees, kind of turn of the century, early 1900s, late 1800s. So David Fairchild is very much known by a lot of people. Frank Meyer, who I'll talk about in great detail in a moment. P.H. Dorset, Walter Swingle, Brandis, Popenoe, Cook. These are all kind of the godfathers of USDA plant exploration. These are the ones that would literally go around the world for years at a time, try and find, you know, new and exotic plants to bring back to the US that could be grown here for the American people, basically. And really, they were personally and professionally inspired by, you know, this whole idea of bringing back plants to the American people because of the diet that Americans had at the time. So if you think about it, at the time, you know, this would be like mid to late 1800s. Really, a lot of people were kind of just eating beans, dairy and cheese products, potatoes, porridge, oats, hominy, corn came along a little bit later, and pork. And really, these were kind of the main components of the American diet at the time. So you can see there's a lot of stuff missing there, right? Where's the where's the green? Where's the fruits and vegetables? Where are they getting their vitamins from? It's a very plant poor diet compared to what we eat now. So these explorers were really interested in changing that, basically. So some of the ones I'm just going to briefly touch on would be David Fairchild. I think a lot of you probably at least know the name, maybe know some of his legacy. So he was the first administrator of the Office of Seed and Plant Introduction, going back to the 1890s. He really had this vision, this vision of bringing all these plants back to the U.S. that could be useful for the American people. Interestingly, he was instrumental in the donation of the tidal basin flowering cherries as well. That was one of his favorite things. As he was exploring the world and went to Japan, he literally just fell in love with flowering cherries. And so he was very much a part of bringing those flowering cherries to Washington, D.C. And he alone is responsible for introducing more than 100,000 plants to the United States, which is just incredible. He's a really, really fascinating character. Some of his notable introductions as he was traveling the world would be things like hops, kale, citron, pomegranate, Egyptian cotton, watermelon, avocado, nectarine, papaya, mango. The list goes on and on and on. And you know, it's worth noting though that these explorers, not all of their introductions were like first-time introductions, right? So some things like watermelon, papaya, mango, these literally did not exist in the American lexicon at the time before David Fairchild. But you know, things like avocado, they were introduced to the US before him, but really he and others were responsible for going around the world to find new selections of them, new varieties to bring back that might be better suited for the American climate, or might be, you know, better for shipping or that sort of thing. So they're not all first-time introductions, although a lot of them are, especially with David Fairchild, over 100,000 plant introductions. Dorset, he did a lot of exploring in China and throughout different parts of Asia. He was responsible for a lot of our soybean introductions and really kind of improving the germplasm of soybean within the American agricultural system. He also discovered a lot of improved cotton varieties, and through his research and explorations in China, he was picking up a lot of different selections and varieties and cultivars of soybean and cotton that he was then bringing back to the United States that either, grew better or were more drought tolerant, disease resistant, whatever the case may be. Walter Swingle was a very interesting person. He was a citrus breeder and a physiologist, and really he spent a lot of time in the lab, but he did get out in the field sometimes. And he's actually the person that developed the Tangelo, if any of you like citrus fruits like that, about 1897. He introduced a lot of different things like dates and pistachios as well. He went around the world and found a lot of new crops to bring back. E.W. Brandeis, he did a lot of exploration in the Pacific Islands, the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, that area. And he's responsible for a lot of sugarcane introductions. And so he introduced more than 3,000 selections and cultivars of sugarcane into the United States, which is pretty incredible. So all of our USDA plant explorers are very interesting and deserve a lot of credit for what they've done for the American agricultural system. But one explorer kind of stands out, at least to me, and this is kind of what I would consider our unsung hero in U.S. agriculture and USDA. This is Frank Nicholas Meyer. So he was exploring late 1800s, early 1900s. He was a Dutch immigrant, and he alone is responsible for introducing about 2,500 new plants into the U.S. agricultural system. So he would go on these arduous years-long botanical explorations all around the world. He was focused primarily on places like Russia and a lot of Asian countries. He went to China several times, so you can kind of see the different expeditions that he worked on as an employee of the USDA. And Frank was a very interesting person. He would often write things like this quote that I have here: "Traveling and wandering are the only things that interest me." He's very much kind of a, leave me alone, let me do my own thing kind of a person. He really liked the whole idea of being out there on the road alone, walking miles and miles and miles a day, doing all of this very arduous work with him and just a couple of people, really. So he kind of thrived in this environment. He was a prolific collector, and on his first expedition, he sent back 20 tons of material. Yes, 20 tons of material. So that would be things like seeds, fruits, rootstock, different seedlings, plants that he sent back to the United States. Sent back a lot of material. And so that picture kind of in the bottom left is a photo of some of the plants that he had packaged up while he was in one of his expeditions in China, getting ready to send back to the US. He often received directives from David Fairchild in Washington, because again, Fairchild was the administrator, the director of the Office of Seed and Plant Introduction. So you can see Fairchild and Meyer up there in the top photo talking in Fairchild's office in DC. So he would often get these directives from Fairchild saying, we need to focus on collecting soybeans. We need to focus on doing these sorts of things. But oftentimes he was kind of left to do his own thing. He would get there to China and have maybe a few things that he needed to check off his list, but then he would kind of just explore. And an interesting little tidbit, a little bit of trivia for you here. That photo of Fairchild and Meyer sitting at that big wooden desk, the National Arboretum still has that giant, massive wooden desk in our library, like reading area at the Arboretum. So if anyone's interested in some Fairchild lore, we do have some of his artifacts, I guess. And so Meyer would travel throughout Asia, Russia, Europe sometimes, with his agricultural explorer passport, which you see on the right there, and essentially just kind of find new interesting stuff. He was not a trained botanist. He was not, necessarily a taxonomist or a systematist, but oftentimes he knew what was important for different cultures, and he would pick up on that and try and ship those things back to the US. So some of his notable introductions, and again, soybeans had been around for a while within the US. It was certainly not like the crop that we think of today, but at the time, this would have been the 1910s, 1900s. He was going around Asia and looking at what different cultures within Asia, specifically China, the different selections and the cultivars that they were growing. You would travel to different villages and see that this particular selection was doing a lot better here versus there, and that's because, oh, there's an elevation change, or whatever the case may be. So we traveled around, and this is one of the directives that Fairchild really wanted him to focus on, because again, Fairchild had this kind of, I don't know, he was almost a savant or something. He realized that soybeans were going to be a very big deal. So he had Meyer look for a lot of different soybean cultivars throughout his travels. So he introduced a lot of soybean introductions to the US. A lot of the soybeans that we still grow today in the US are from Meyer's introductions. Apricots. This is one, these might have been around, about this time in America, but it certainly hadn't caught on. No one was really growing them. No one was really maybe interested in them, but he was bringing back apricots as he saw that, they were very delicious. They grew easily in a particular climate that had kind of a match with certain climates within the US. So they're bringing back a lot of apricots, a lot of Rosaceae type things. They're very interested in pears, and of course, this is another one that, pears, of course, existed in the US, but he was bringing back new varieties, new selections that would grow better, instead of just maybe the one or two pear selections that were growing in the US, circa 1910, he was bringing back 40, 50, 60 different selections that might grow better or might be more appetizing to the American people. And it's, worth mentioning as well, and Judy talked about this before the seminar. So not all of his introductions were good, right? I mean, there's, kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly. So among the pears that he brought back that he was very interested in would be the calorie pear. So Fairchild directed him to find as many of these as he could, and they really wanted to use that as a rootstock for the existing pear industry, because calorie pear was resistant to the fire blight, which is kind of, decimating the pear industry in the US. And it's kind of interesting, on his last expedition, Meyer packed up about 5,000 pounds of rootstock and fruits of calorie that were bound for the US. And it's really these that were the introduction of calorie pear into the US. So, again, there are a lot of places that ban calorie pear. So good intentions. We thought that it would have been a really good idea, but some things just didn't quite pan out. Now, Frank Meyer, you might be familiar with this little introduction, the Meyer lemon. So it's named after Frank Meyer. He was the one who brought it back from China, and it's a very interesting story. So it was almost overlooked, and he kind of walked on by it. He was in China near Beijing about 1907, and he saw this lemon tree growing in a container in front of a man's house, and he asked the owner about it, and he said, "Oh, it's we just kind of grow it for like an ornamental. It's just an interesting kind of plant." And he almost walked on and didn't really think much about it, but he said, "You know what? Hold on, let me take a few lemons from it." He tried them. He really liked it. They were a bit sweeter. They had more of a lemony taste than what we were used to, and he really liked it. So he took a few lemons, he took a few cuttings from it, sent those back, and of course now the Meyer lemon is kind of everywhere. And I really love these little quotes from Meyer in all the correspondence that he sent back and forth to Washington. there were kind of these gems in here where he would say things like, of course, my work will not be quite appreciated until many years after, but I dare say some of the things then will have been found to be very valuable. And this is one of many examples of Meyer's introductions that are certainly very valuable. So you can find Meyer lemon in a lot of different things. You know, you go to the grocery store and you find Meyer lemon mints and vinaigrettes and cookies, the lemons themselves, lemonade, pastries made out of Meyer lemon. It's a very, very widespread, very, very popular introduction that he brought back to the U.S. Some things that are more kind of on the ornamental side. He wasn't just focused on crops and agriculture. He was looking for things that would kind of benefit American gardens as well, which maybe isn't of interest to everyone, but the USDA is very much interested in cultivated plants and ornamentals, that sort of thing. So ginkgo had been around for a while. It was rediscovered in China a couple centuries earlier, but there were really no ginkgos growing in the US at the time. And so Meyer was very interested in ginkgos. Anytime he saw one, during his travels, he would collect cones from them, fruits, and ship them back. And so basically all of the ginkgos that we have in the US today are, they came from the seeds that Meyer collected and sent back from China during his visits. Some of the other ornamentals that he brought back and he was interested in would be things like fragrant viburnums, lilacs, junipers, and here's another one, wisteria, which of course is not a great thing to have around anymore. Some spruces that he was pretty interested in. White bark pine was one of his favorites. So while he's out there, keep in mind, I mean, this is hard work. This is grueling work to be out there in these really extreme, rugged conditions. I mean, and this is years at a time. Some of these expeditions are 2 or 3 years, back to back. He didn't come home and go back out. He was out there on the road 3 years straight. Very, very arduous traveling. He would walk about 20 miles each day. And, keep in mind that when he's in these rugged conditions, he's not just sightseeing and collecting a few things here and there. He's collecting fruits and whole plants and seeds, and he's pressing vouchers. He's taking and developing photos. So all these photos that you see here are ones that Frank photographed and developed himself, basically in the field. Packing material to send back, replying to his correspondence from Fairchild. I mean, it was not an easy life. And so the legacy that Frank really leaves behind, this is one of my favorite quotes of Frank Meyer. He says, "I will be famous, just wait a century or two." So at the time, he was very, very much not interested in the publicity and all the excitement that was happening with all the new stuff that he was sending back. He didn't want to have anything to do with it, but he realized that some of the stuff, maybe a lot of the stuff that he was sending back to the US were going to be important at some point. And so I feel like that legacy lives on, especially with this, the Frank Meyer Agricultural Explorer Medal, which is still given out today to researchers who exemplify Meyer's passion for discovery and his ingenuity with plant exploration. So unfortunately, Frank Meyer met a very untimely death during one of his expeditions in China. He was on a riverboat in China, and we don't know exactly the circumstances of what happened. It's still a mystery to this day whether he just fell overboard or if he jumped or was pushed. We don't know. But in 1918, at the age of 43, if I'm not mistaken, he died in China. But the legacy that he provided to American culture certainly lives on through the Meyer lemon, but 2,500 other plant introductions that we still use and think of today. So if you open up your fridge or your pantry, or look down at the plate from your dinner tonight, I am willing to bet there's at least a couple things in there that Frank Meyer introduced to the American people. So switching gears a little bit, I'm going to talk about something that's a little bit more contemporary, if you will. The collapse of coffee. I'm sorry to get everyone down, I know. So let's fast forward to the 1950s. So around this time, coffee is certainly a booming industry around the world, but certainly in the Americas as well. But researchers, plant geneticists, et cetera, they they could kind of foresee doom on the horizon. So the coffee plantations that were in the Americas were essentially failing by the 1950s. And part of that is because of the genetic diversity or lack thereof within the American coffee industry. So just to give you a bit of background about what I'm talking about here. So coffee, coffea, is native to parts of Africa, in the Middle East, and Ethiopia is really kind of the center of diversity for coffea. And so this goes back to, like 1500s is what we're talking about here. Coffee plants made their way around different parts of Africa into the Middle East, and then Yemen really became kind of the center of coffee production, of mocha, right? So about the 1620s, though, some we've got some interference. If anyone's able to mute that. Thank you. Okay. So we had some foreigners from Europe, specifically the Netherlands, come and do some explorations in this part of the world, in the Middle East, in the 1620s. And the Yemen people were very strict about what could cross their borders. And so essentially no coffee was getting out of Yemen. But basically two plants came out of Yemen about 1620, two coffee plants. They were smuggled back to Amsterdam. They were propagated, made their way to Paris. From there, they were exported to Martinique. And then from there, they kind of distributed across the New World tropics, Central America, Northern South America, the West Indies. But really, I mean, keep in mind, all these plants that exist in the New World tropics, the Americas, basically came from one or two coffee plants. So you can already tell that's going to be a problem as time goes on. And so just to give you an idea, this is the modern coffee industry. This is based on 2022 data. There was about $110 billion spent on coffee in 2022, and that's just in the United States, by the way. This is not worldwide. Interestingly, about 60% of the global coffee is grown in the Americas, even though that's not really where they're native to. They're not supposed to be there. 60% comes from the Americas. And about 100 million people worldwide depend on coffee as their main source of income. So just keep these kind of numbers in mind, and that none of this would be possible if the whole coffee industry collapsed in the Americas. And so the USDA was very much aware of this problem. Researchers were, pinging the USDA to do something about it. Not that the US grows much, if any, coffee. Really, we can only grow it in, a little bit of Florida and, Puerto Rico. But this was very much kind of a large
Hawaii.
scale. What's that?
Kona Coffee, Hawaii.
Yes, true. That's true. And in Hawaii. So not that, continental US was very much involved in coffee, but this is very much like a wide scale kind of hair on fire, governmental response kind of a thing. So the USDA was aware of it and was seeing things within the American coffee industry where coffee was being decimated by pests and pathogens and disease, and it's because there was virtually no resistance due to all these inbred lines of the New World coffee that we have. They're essentially all clones of each other. So USDA enlisted the help of Fred Meyer, not any relation to Frank Meyer. This gets a little confusing. We have a lot of Meyers in the botanical world for some reason. But Fred Meyer was a USNA researcher at the Arboretum. He was one of the herbarium curators many years ago. And in the early 1960s, about 1961 through 1965, he did several trips to Ethiopia to try and find, native, healthy, robust populations of wild coffee there in its native range as well. And the whole idea was to send him out there, find these wild populations, or at least, semi-wild cultivated populations, and send that germplasm back to the Americas to, not to put too fine of a point on it, but basically to save the New World coffee industry. So for many years, he was in Ethiopia, like I said, going around trying to find wild populations of coffee. And not just that, though. It's not like he just went into Ethiopia and went into the wilds, found coffee and brought him back, and end of story. But he was talking with the native peoples. He would go to their markets. He would go to see where coffee was processed. He would see how they grow coffee. He would see what it is that they're doing to help with, irrigation problems, erosion problems. How did they handle pests? What kind of pollination procedures were they following? So he didn't just come in, take a bunch of stuff and leave. He was, for many years kind of involved with the people in Ethiopia as well. And so he was finding a lot of wild populations. He would go to these coffee plantations, and again, different markets, and see what they're selling, see what works well, see what's popular. And all along the way, he's journaling what it is he's seeing, writing down copious notes about what works, what doesn't, making vouchers to send back to the Arboretum. And then from there, sending back fruit, seed, germplasm, cuttings, because the whole idea, again, is to introduce new genetics into the American coffee industry. So he was sending all this germplasm, what we now call germplasm, back to the United States, and then from there it would be distributed to, Colombia and Brazil and Jamaica and all these other places that really rely very heavily on coffee, and trying to introduce new genetic characters into the coffee industry here. So, and here's Fred overlooking a lake in Ethiopia. So next time you have a cup of coffee, maybe you had one this morning, maybe you'll have one tomorrow morning, just think about the USDA's role in, helping to save the coffee industry that we sort of know of and rely on today, that we kind of take for granted. Moving forward in time a little bit more, I want to talk about some of our more contemporary, our more modern explorations that we do in conjunction with a lot of other countries, and specifically with China. So as I mentioned before, the USDA is very interested in cultivated ornamental plants, among many other things, crops and crop wild relatives, obviously. But one thing that we're very interested in is cultivated ornamentals. And so I'm sure a lot of you realize that a lot of our cultivated plants, and coincidentally a lot of our invasives as well, come from Asia, and specifically from China. But we have this agreement with the People's Republic of China. It's called NACPEC, or the North America China Plant Exploration Consortium. And it's really a collaborative effort between the Chinese Academy of Sciences and several other institutions. So we have the USDA, specifically the National Arboretum, the Morton Arboretum, Arnold Arboretum, Morris Arboretum, Holden Arboretum, a lot of arboreta, Longwood Gardens, and the University of British Columbia. And so starting about 1993, we, these institutions got together and started developing this idea of exploring China. As things were trying to open up more, of course, China opened up earlier than this, but looking at China as kind of a source of novel plant germplasm, especially as it relates to cultivated ornamental material. So a lot of the missions of NACPEC, those expeditions include broadening the genetic pool of plants that are already in cultivation, so trying to find wild relatives of those cultivated plants and bringing that germplasm back, selecting new ornamentals that currently did not or do not exist in the ornamental trade, conserving rare species, rare and endangered species that grow in China that would also actually grow quite well in the US. And then also collaborating between our two countries, making this connection, on a very broad, on a very wide scale, to try and collaborate and network between our countries. And so this map is a little bit outdated. This was put together in 2010 based on the expeditions that were done up to that point. And of course, there are other expeditions since 2010. Our latest one, it's not every year that we go on these expeditions. I believe our latest one was 2019, if I'm not mistaken. But this just gives you kind of an idea of the different expeditions throughout the years, looking at different parts of China, and really, again, like I said, collaborating with our Chinese colleagues, trying to find new ornamentals, trying to find germplasm to bring back. A lot of our expeditions were what I would consider exploratory in nature, right? So sometimes we kind of, just like Frank Meyer, sometimes we would just, the collective we would go out there and just try and kind of find new, interesting stuff that might work well in the US, although some things were a bit more targeted, which I'll talk about in a moment. So throughout these NACPEC expeditions, it's not just we're going to China, bringing back germplasm and yippee hooray, we did a thing. Our work doesn't stop there, right? So we're preserving vouchers. The National Arboretum Herbarium has a full set of all the NACPEC vouchers that exist. The germplasm and seed storage is a part of what we do. We grow out the plants in our nurseries and greenhouses. We distribute the germplasm. We try and get duplicates sent out to all of our cooperating institutions to make sure that we have pretty widespread germplasm out there. And interestingly, actually a large portion of the National Arboretum's Asian collections, which are out on kind of the, would that be the northeast end of the National Arboretum grounds, if you've come to visit us, a large portion of the Asian collections come from NACPEC trips, actually. Although interestingly, we do have a lot of original material from like Meyer and Fairchild days as well, which is pretty interesting. We have a lot of very unique things growing on the Arboretum grounds. So just to give you an idea of kind of the scope of what we've been doing with NACPEC, a little over 1,700 vouchers that we've collected in China. We have germplasm accessions, so that would include seeds and fruits, different reproductive parts that we would send back to the US to then distribute. And then living plants that came back from these NACPEC expeditions, a little over 900. And then again, we can, clone these and distribute them to other institutions that are interested. So I mentioned that some expeditions are exploratory, some are going to be a bit more targeted. So this would be an example of an expedition where the USDA focused on a single taxon. So this was, if I'm not mistaken, the 1998 NACPEC expedition. We are really focused on trying to find more examples of Chinese hemlock. And the reason for that is because the Chinese hemlock that existed in the US at the time essentially came from one single plant that was introduced in 1910. And, you can imagine that's just a genetic bottleneck nightmare right there. And the reason this is important, though, is because we needed more diversity for our breeding programs because our native hemlocks were being decimated by hemlock woolly adelgid, which coincidentally also came from China. And so these expeditions went out to find wild populations of Chinese hemlock and, bring these back to the US to introduce into our breeding program so that we could hopefully potentially produce hemlocks that were resistant to the hemlock woolly adelgid. And as it turns out, yes, we were successful in that. So the National Arboretum was able to develop the very first hybrid hemlock woolly adelgid resistant trees. These are two of our releases, our cultivars. So we have Crossroad and Traveler. So Crossroad, which you see on the left there, it's a hybrid between Tsuga chinensis and Tsuga caroliniana. And the chinensis parent is from a NACPEC collection that came in from China. Although interestingly, the Traveler one that's on the right there, the chinensis parent, we discovered that chinensis at the old homestead, I guess, if you will, the old home of David Fairchild in Chevy Chase, Maryland. So we had no idea, this is not part of the 1910 introduction, but we had no idea that David Fairchild had a different genetic individual of chinensis just growing in his garden. So as we were doing this breeding work, we discovered that Fairchild had a chinensis, and we used that to create Traveler as well. So Crossroad and Traveler that you see here are the very first hybrid hemlock woolly adelgid resistant trees that exist in the United States, and we're working on distributing these to the nursery trade to get them out there. Now, along those same lines, if you will, this is a much broader look, though. I want to just kind of mention the U.S. National Plant Germplasm System, or the NPGS. So this is an initiative that was started around 1972-ish with this whole idea of going out into the world, into the natural world, finding wild relatives of, what we consider important to us, whether it be crops or ornamentals or whatever the case may be, collecting germplasm, seeds, fruits, rootstock cutting, whatever, sending those back and preserving them throughout the United States, in case something were to go wrong. For example, if we have this monoculture of corn and a disease comes through and wipes out our entire corn industry, well, obviously that would not be a good thing. So we've been collecting different varieties, strains, selections, cultivars of corn, among many, 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 many other things, to make sure that we have, genetic diversity available that we can breed into our crop systems. So the NPGS has 30 sites across the country. These are mostly at USDA sites, as well as some research institutions like universities who are co-located. Within the germplasm system, you can see some numbers here of the different families, genera, and species represented. And total accessions across the country, we have a little over 621,000 accessions that we're growing across the country. So each of these different sites are kind of responsible for different crops and accessions. So for example, the Ames, Iowa station, they're responsible for soybean and corn and a lot of the kind of, traditional Midwest crop plants. Corvallis, Oregon is responsible for things like blueberries and cranberries and strawberries. College Station, Texas station is they're responsible for like pecans and hickories. The Geneva, New York station is responsible for half of the apple collection, a lot of grapes, hemp, that sort of thing. And then the Miami Tropical Horticultural Research Station is responsible for all of our tropical plants like coffee, cacao, those sorts of things. And so within the National Plant Germplasm System, our goal here is to, preserve plant crop genetic diversity for today and for tomorrow. So that includes things like cryopreservation. You see on the bottom left there, we do have an enormous collection of corn germplasm that's just devoted to corn. We do a lot of propagation and clonal work, but it also includes a lot of living plant material as well. Of course, this is a lot of living material. So our National Plant Germplasm System scientists and our curators of the different crops that they are responsible for go around the world and they find wild relatives. They bring them back to the US as germplasm to make sure that we're preserving this. So this would include things like raspberries and blackberries from Vietnam, different beans from Guatemala, cabbage from Sweden, soybean from Australia, excuse me, sunflower seeds from Canada, sorghum from Cameroon, flowering cherry blossoms from Japan, cotton from Russia, potatoes from Bolivia, mung beans from Afghanistan. So we have these scientists that go literally all over the world that are focused on usually specific taxa that they're responsible for, trying to find wild relatives to bring back to the United States so that we can preserve that germplasm, especially for our horticultural and agricultural needs. And as I mentioned, we're not just preserving them; they're not just in cryopreservation. They're not just preserved herbarium specimens or something like that, but we're actively growing them, we're propagating them, we're cloning them, we're evaluating them, we're distributing them. And so all of these wild collected material, it's really vital to the NPGS's existence, why they exist within the US. And of course, just as a fun a fun fact, because I'm very much in tune with like the herbarium world, I love to see herbarium specimens that come across that are documenting these sorts of things. So within the National Arboretum Herbarium, we do have specimens that Fairchild collected on his expeditions in 1893. We have the bulk of Frank Meyer's specimens from when he was in China and Russia. We have all of Fred Meyer's coffee expedition vouchers. We have a full set of the NACPEC expedition vouchers. We have vouchers that are constantly coming in that represent all the work and research that's going on across the National Plant Germplasm System. And so, with that, I just want to kind of close by saying these USDA botanical explorations are really vital to our kind of our everyday lives, right? Like I mentioned before, you can open up your fridge or your pantry or whatever you ate tonight, and there's got to be at least a couple things on your plate that you can trace directly back to one of the explorers that we have here within the USDA. So it's really the travels and the travelers that have transformed our everyday lives. And so that was a very big, broad overview. I hope I didn't skip over too much. But with that, I just want to say thank you for your time. Thank you for spending your January 2nd with me. If you have any questions, I'm going to open it up to questions this evening. But if you want to contact me later about anything, I have my contact information there. And with that, again, thank you. And I'm happy to talk about any plant exploration questions you might have. Thanks.
Thank you, Harlan. I see there's one question in the chat, so maybe we could start with that. And if anyone else wants to type a question in the chat, they can, or just say it out loud, probably that's fine too. So the question is, has the chill in US-China relations affected NACPEC?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So I mentioned that our last NACPEC expedition was in 2019. But that expedition was actually one where Chinese scientists came over to North America, and they were doing some exploring within like the southeast part of US. And I don't have the list with me right now, but yes, definitely a lot of the chilling of the relations between our two countries has kind of put a damper on NACPEC expeditions. So we're in kind of a lull right now, and we're hoping that we can get back to doing some exploring at some point. And the same is true with some other countries, like with Russia. You know, a lot of our plant introductions do come from Russia. In fact, our very first PI, our very first plant introduction from 1898 was a cabbage from Russia. And you know, throughout the years, there have been other introductions from Russia, but you know, of course, there's a lot of tension globally. So there are some parts of the world that we're kind of not involved with right now. Yeah.
We have to get permission to even co-author or conduct research with collaborators from China now, whether they have anything to do with USDA research or not.
Yep.
Okay. I see some hands raised now. So I think I saw Jill put hers up first, and then Mary, and then Judy. So
thanks. I just had a quick question. It was a really interesting talk. Thank you. I noticed cotton was introduced from way the heck up in cold North Russia. How does that work?
Well, to be fair, the position of that little cotton clip art was not exactly not quite where it should have been. That was just a more representative of
like countrywide.
Yeah, Russia, right.
I was gonna say that's weird. All right.
Yeah, not quite that far north. You're right.
Thank you.
Mary?
Yes, so I'm really interested in the coffee story that you were telling. And by the way, the talk was, oh, I just loved it. So exciting.
Thank you.
So the increase in diversity, do you know if there's been a effort for shade tolerant cultivars? I mean, not just like general robust germplasm, but specifically for that, you know, to allow more shade grown coffee.
You know, just off the top of my head, I'm not exactly sure if that's one of the things that was or is part of the focus. Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head. Although I do know, I just read something recently as I was kind of researching for this talk. There have been new discoveries within Ethiopia and some of the other Eastern African countries of some varieties, some selections of coffee that might be like naturally caffeine free.
Wow.
Those sorts of things. So like we're still we're still making these discoveries and trying to introduce them back into our into our everyday lives as well. So yeah, with the shade tolerance, I don't know.
Yeah, it's very interesting, the caffeine free, because that would, you know, protect us from all those organics that are used to decaffeinate. So
Right.
that's terrific. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, Judy?
Since my mind is on invasives, I have a question relating to that. And by the way, excellent talk, very interesting. Is there, obviously back in the earlier part of the 20th century, this wasn't a consideration. It's really become more of a consideration now. But is there any attempt before introducing plant parts from China, Russia, or elsewhere outside the US to determine the likelihood of invasiveness of those plant species?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Judy. So you're right. So at this time when, Fairchild and Meyer and others were introducing plants from China, it was essentially like, okay, collect these cuttings from China, ship them back to DC, and they basically went straight to the farmers. They went to botanic gardens and just, let's see what happens. Now, of course, by today's standards, that's pretty crazy. So USDA does have some safeguards in place that, we we try and be more careful now. So some of the things, everything that comes in basically still has to go through all the APHIS permitting. It has to be checked out by APHIS agents, Customs and Border Protection. Especially being here in kind of the DC Beltsville area, we do benefit from having the APHIS headquarters pretty close by, and so we're able to, a lot of our stuff goes into quarantine in the Beltsville area, and then as it's evaluated, it can come out relatively quickly. For the National Arboretum specifically, we still go through all those measures as well, but we've kind of put in place another layer, I guess. I don't know how helpful it is, but instead of just bringing everything directly into the National Arboretum into DC and seeing what happens, we do have a grow out area in Beltsville at the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center, and it's not like secure. It's not closed off from the world, but we do try and grow out our stuff there first for many years to see what the invasiveness is like, if any, and then if it all checks out, then we'll bring them to the Arboretum and we'll distribute the germplasm. Or if we do find a problem, then we nix it there. So we do try, although plants kind of do what they want anyway.
As a follow-up question to that, I know that APHIS is involved, but we've certainly had a number of introductions of invasive insects and pathogens. Do you do any additional evaluation to make sure that the next I don't know, hemlock woolly adelgid isn't being brought in?
Right. So as part of the APHIS inspections, everything that we bring in essentially goes through a full inspection. So not just looking at things like invasiveness, but also looking for nematode pests, looking for fungi that might be on the leaves, looking for insects that might be a problem. So yes, they do go through a full kind of diagnostic check before ever getting into a garden setting. Yeah.
Do you do an additional one though, besides that?
No, not at the Arboretum. Essentially, once it's released from APHIS, we kind of consider that our green light,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And part of that is just because we don't have a lot of expertise in-house, on that aspect. We do have some like plant pathologists, but unless there's something very specific that the nematologist in APHIS needs to look at, or a mycology expert, we don't pursue it too much further.
Thank you.
Sure.
There's a note in the chat about how that Q has been very interested in coffee research the past decade, so that might be a place to go to if you're interested in more.
Yeah.
And then there's two more questions. I think Steve, you've had your hand up first, and then Joe.
Thanks a lot. To what extent has collection focused on producing phenotypes that are contribute to disease immunity in crops? That's my first question. And my second question is, how has Nikolai Valikov influenced the collections in the 1920s, the work of Valikov in the Central Asia?
Yeah, so with respect to your like disease resistance question, that is a lot of what our scientists, what our national plant germplasm curators are focused on. So what they'll do is, if we have a curator that's focused on peanuts, for example, and we've identified that there's a problem with a particular disease in peanuts, our scientists, our curators will go out to into its native range and try and find phenotypes, germplasm that we at least we think are resistant to particular diseases, and bring that back, grow it as part of the national plant germplasm system. And then like I said, we can distribute all of that germplasm pretty freely to farmers, to researchers, to others that really need that disease-resistant phenotype. So yes, we are actively very much looking into those sorts of things, and not just disease resistance, but drought tolerance, and making sure that we have enough genetic diversity within our crop and agricultural system. So that's very much on the minds of all of our scientists. And to the second part of your question, I don't know that I really have a good answer right now, unfortunately. Yeah, I don't know that I could speak much to that aspect, Steve. I'm sorry.
Okay, Joe, you're up, I think.
All right. So, I mean, your biographical descriptions are fascinating, and one thing that comes out with people like Frank Meyer and others is just sort of their obsessive, single-minded quest to find and bring back plants. And so, following up on Judy's question, I'm sort of wondering, when did people start to have misgivings, maybe express misgivings, like maybe we shouldn't be bringing back these ornamentals? I mean, that's a fairly modern topic, the understanding of the invasiveness, but I'm sure that these are scientists and very smart people, that misgivings were probably happening in the early 20th century. Did you cover any of that in your research?
I think you're absolutely right that this idea of being very cautious of introductions is much more of a modern thing, because it seems like very much at the time, late 1800s, early 1900s, it was kind of just it was a free-for-all. Let's find cool stuff, let's bring it back, and whatever. But I do know maybe this is not so much on the invasive side of things, but more kind of on the pathology, or at least the invasive insects and pests side of things. But I do know that David Fairchild had sort of a nemesis within the USDA. He was an entomologist, a pathologist by training, and this would have been around, oh gosh, let's see, like 1915 or so. And this man, and his name escapes me at the moment, but he was really one of the early adopters of, like, wait a minute, wait. Especially with the cherry blossoms that were coming in, that David Fairchild was so excited about, and bring all these things. And he was the very kind of first one to be like, wait a minute, what's on them? What's in the roots? And in fact, this is kind of a tangent here, but the very first shipment of cherry blossoms that came in from Japan to Washington, D.C. had to be destroyed, which was a whole big fiasco, and that was largely in part due to this entomologist, this pathologist within the USDA that very, very much with a microscope, literally, was looking at all of these cherry blossoms that were coming in as this big hurrah from Japan, connecting these two cultures and countries. But he was like, wait a minute, this is there's parasitic nematodes on the roots, we've got fungal spores here, we've got all these things happening. And he essentially convinced President Taft that they were no good and they needed to be incinerated, which they were. And so it was the second batch of cherry blossoms from Japan that now reside along the tidal basin, and some at the National Arboretum, by the way. But you're right. I don't really know at what point in history it kind of clicked with these plant explorers that, maybe everything we're sending back is not great. Because I think they just had these, very, very high, ambitions of just trying to save, the pear industry with calorie pear, or trying to solve erosion with kudzu, but then not really thinking about the consequences. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'm gonna make a comment as someone who works in the plant exchange office for the National Plant Germplasm System that we have very few explorations now. They are usually multiple years in the planning stage. We have a whole bunch that did not occur because of the pandemic and because of funding issues with international treaties and restrictions on germplasm movement, especially in some countries like China and Brazil now. There are just more and more explorations that people might like to do that are just never going to happen because they're not financially feasible, they're not politically feasible, and there aren't the kind of treaty cooperation pieces in place for them to happen. Which is unfortunate because, you know, the USDA sends its germplasm all over the world. It's not just for people in the US. We ship material out, you know, to people who are doing research into disease resistance, drought resistance, breeding, you know, new flavors, cold tolerance, salt tolerance, all those things. You know, basically we're working to feed the world, and it's easier if there's cooperation, but in today's political climate, you can't just go and collect plants anymore.
Are there thoughts of forging new partnerships with countries that are a little more sort of amenable, like, you know, compared to China, for example, or?
Do you want, this is Anne Francis. I'm also with the USDA. I think there's a lot of interest in forging new partnerships. It really, part of it depends on the political climate, like with China, but a lot of it really depends on which countries are signatory to certain treaties, and it gets really, really complicated. So the desire is there, but it's very unlikely to for those restrictions to change. And it's very difficult to even find, I can't even say workaround, because everything at the USDA, there is no workaround for international law. It must be followed. So we're very interested in if we can form specific collaborations that would allow us to bring germplasm back into the National Plant Germplasm System, but because it is accessible to anybody qualified to use it, we can't track, we can't distribute royalties, we can't participate in the benefit and access sharing that's required by many of these international treaty restrictions, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. That's interesting. Okay, I think Mary, did you have another question? And then
Yes, I just wanted to sort of following up what Melanie was saying about the many benefits of this germplasm, of course, that's been collected. Ecologists really have had lots of opportunities to get you know, wild plants from various places as a result of this and do some really great work. You know, I you know, I'm certainly glad that so many people have worked so hard to find far-flung populations and you know, that are there for research.
okay, I think that's maybe all the questions. Thank you very much, Harlan. That was
I have
here
one other question. I'm wondering whether with these whatever expeditions happen these days, there's an increasing focus on climate change and finding plants that will be and germplasm that will be more able to grow in a warming climate or a climate with unpredictable weather.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, it'll depend on, you know, the plant group, of course, and the particular curator that's responsible for that the particular group, but you're right. A lot of the focus, I think, is going to start shifting toward how how can we find germplasm that better suits a warming climate. Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you very much, Harlan. That was an awesome talk and a lot of interesting questions as well. I guess next presentation might be in person.
Yeah, that's the plan.
Yeah. So plan for that. So stay tuned for more information, and I guess any other announcements or anything before we sign off here. Andrea Weeks will be the next speaker. Okay.
If
Thank you,
anyone
everyone.
has any questions about the invasive plant bill, I can stay on.
Well, thank you, everyone. I appreciated it.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye. Take care, everyone. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.